Welcome to part one of How to Improvise Sourdough, a series where I'll teach you how to improvise your sourdough schedule and reduce discard, lowering the barriers that you might have for making sourdough more frequently. In this part, I'm going to do a really rough price comparison to show you why homemade bread is better than store-bought. Here's a peek at the rest of the series. So first, for those who may not know, sourdough is a bread made of flour, water, salt, and leavened with wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. These microorganisms naturally occur in your flour and environment, and you culture your own mix by mixing flour and water and letting it sit at room temp. That is an oversimplification, so make sure to look up a video on how to make your own starter, or you can buy it online or get it from a friend who has some. Essentially, you need only 3 ingredients. So for the price comparison, I'll just compare the weight of the bread to the weight of flour, since flour makes up most of the weight, and water and salt are basically negligible. And for context, I'm in Ontario, Canada, and I'll be using the Walmart website to grab prices. So these great value loaves are $2.48 for 675 grams. Let's say your average sourdough loaf calls for 500 grams of flour plus 12.5 grams of flour that needs to be mixed into the starter. Out of this 10 kg bag of AP flour, we could get 19 loaves plus leftover flour. That comes down to 52 cents plus tax per loaf for $9.88. So 52 cents for a homemade loaf of bread versus $2.48 for the cheapest and probably lowest quality store-bought bread is a no-brainer, right? If you look at the unit cost for store-bought sourdough bread, the winner is also very obvious. It's sourdough, homemade. However, there's also the cost of your time and labor, which we will discuss in later shorts. Welcome to part 2 of How to Improvise Sourdough, a series where I'll teach you how to improvise your sourdough schedule and reduce discard, lowering the barriers you might have for making sourdough more frequently. In this part, I'm going to quickly mention other benefits of homemade bread, whereas in part 1, I already covered the financial benefit. So here's a peek of the rest of the series. As for the nutritional benefits, sourdough is fermented, which can increase digestibility, antioxidants, and the availability of nutrients. Fermentation also lowers the glycemic index, meaning you'll have a more steady rise and fall in blood sugar compared to white bread. This is a great option for those who need to manage their blood sugar, but they don't want to give up bread. And even if you're not diabetic or pre-diabetic, it's good to live preventatively. Sourdough recipes are also not limited to bread. You can make long fermented cakes, cinnamon rolls, pizza, pancakes, and so much more to get some of these fermented benefits. You can also replace baking powder and soda in your baked goods if you want to watch your sodium intake as well. You would also be avoiding consumption of the extra additives that they use in these commercial breads, such as preservatives, and you're reducing your use of single-use plastics from bread bags. Check out part 3 to learn how to improvise your sourdough schedule so that it fits into any lifestyle. Welcome to part 3 of How to Improvise Your Sourdough, a series where I'll teach you how to improvise your sourdough schedule and reduce the need for discarding. In this part, I'm going to teach you how to improvise your schedule to fit in for if you have a 9 to 5 or just any kind of lifestyle where you can't babysit a dough all day. So let's discuss in broad strokes the phases of baking sourdough. Phase 1. Feeding your starter. In your starter, you have wild yeast and bacteria, and when you add flour, the yeast feed on the starch and produce carbon dioxide bubbles as a byproduct. These microbes have ideal temperatures where they are most active. At room temp, they are active and multiplying as they sit on your counter and feed. In the fridge, this slows down. Typically, what you do after feeding is wait a couple of hours until the starter doubles in height, but this is kind of arbitrary because you could wait until your starter has tripled, or you can even use unfed starter. The doubling in height is just an indicator that there's a good number of active yeast to work with, and more active yeast means faster fermentation. Feed your starter a couple of hours before you start mixing, then we move on to the next phase, which is mixing. After mixing, you're going to go through a set of stretch and folds every 20 to 30 minutes until your dough becomes smooth and elastic. So let's say 3 sets. But if you're really pressed for time, you could probably get away with 1 set. And in that set, just try to get as many natural stretch and folds in as the dough will allow. You should start this phase when you have around 20 minutes to 1.5 hours, where you can occasionally come back to the dough. This would be good for in the evening as you wind down for bed, or the first thing in the morning if you have time. It's also good to do this before any long stretches of time where you can't attend to the dough, such as when you're sleeping or at work, because that time can be used for bulk fermentation. Check out part 4 for the next phases. Welcome to part 4 of How to Improvise Sourdough, a series where I teach you how to improvise your schedule and reduce discard. So in the last video, I covered the starter and mixing the ingredients. Now we're on to phase 3, bulk fermentation. You're going to leave your dough for several hours until your dough doubles in size. Now this part is really flexible. My dough ferments overnight, so maybe 10 hours, and I will prepare it in the morning, which is going to require around 2 hours. If you think your kitchen is too warm and fermentation will happen too fast, add less sourdough starter to begin with. You can also add unfed starter if you forgot to prepare it beforehand. Here's some pizza dough that rose with an unfed starter that had been sitting in the fridge for a week. The dough will just be the food for the starter, and it may take longer to double. Otherwise, if you don't think you'll be ready for the next phases right when you wake up, you could slow down fermentation by popping your dough in the fridge overnight and pulling it out in the morning to ferment during your workday. You can even leave your dough to cold ferment in the fridge for like 3 to 5 days if you don't have time to babysit it or you want to prepare it well in advance for the weekend or something. On the flip side, if you want to shorten your fermentation time, add twice the amount of starter when mixing or place your dough in a warm place. If you adjust the starter amount, you might want to adjust the recipe to account for that. I like adding equal parts flour and water to my starter because that makes the math really easy. I just divide by 2. Phase 4, shaping. After fermentation, shape your dough. Follow for part 5. Welcome to part 5 of How to Improvise Sourdough, a short series where I'll teach you how to improvise your sourdough and reduce discard. Last video I covered up until phase 4, which was shaping, and now we're on to phase 5 and 6, proofing and baking. Since shaping is going to knock out some of the air in your dough, you want to proof the dough so that it regains some of that air and size. I proof from 1 to 2 hours at room temperature while I'm walking my dog in the morning. I proof my bread until it looks like a nice size for the final loaf, and then I bake it for 40 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're not ready to bake yet, slow down proofing in your fridge until you have the time to bake, or just proof it entirely in the fridge. You could probably leave it proofing for more than 2 hours, but you just want to avoid leaving it for too long because that might over ferment it and cause your bread to collapse. Follow for part 6 where I teach you how to turn any recipe into a sourdough recipe. Welcome to part 6 of How to Improvise Sourdough, a short series where I'll teach you how to improvise your sourdough and reduce discard. You can turn most recipes into their sourdough version. The easiest way to do this is to find an existing sourdough recipe and follow their measurements. I think it's just me having unrefined taste buds, but I don't eat sourdough for the tangy flavor. I don't taste anything complex like people describe, but I like the benefits of long fermentation. A lot of sourdough recipes just add discard for flavor and use baking soda and powder to leaven quickly. In order to convert these recipes to long fermented, follow these steps. If it's a stiffer dough that needs shaping and proofing for air, like pizza dough or cookies or cinnamon rolls, you'll want to mix, then bulk ferment, shape, proof to a good final size, and bake, as expected. If it's a wet dough requiring leavening, but the shape can be provided by a container such as cake or muffins, you should mix the ingredients and then bulk ferment or leaven the batter in the final container before baking. The wet batter will look bubbly and rise, and you can transfer straight into the oven without knocking out the air. For something like pancake batter, if you're relying solely on the starter to leaven, mix it the night before, let it ferment in the mixing bowl, and just pour gently to retain the bubbles. Since you're leavening with wild yeast, you don't need to add baking powder or soda, which may not even be as effective after a long fermentation because it could react with the acid and the liquid in the dough. If you are going to add them at the end of your fermentation stage to wet batters right before baking or cooking, but mixing it will knock some of the air that has already developed. To convert a non-sourdough recipe, you can add sourdough starter and reduce the amount of flour and liquid in the original recipe by the amount that's in the added starter. Or don't, unless the recipe is really sensitive to changes in ingredient ratios. Then follow the steps I mentioned before to bulk ferment. Follow for the last part 7, on how to reduce your discard production. Welcome to part 7, the last part of how to improvise your sourdough, a short series where I'll teach you how to improvise your sourdough schedule and reduce discard, among other things. So if you're feeding your starter every day without baking just as often, I see why you would need a discard starter. If you didn't discard, the amount of flour required to feed the growing number of microbes would be hard to manage. But if you're not baking every day, then you don't need to feed it every day unless you're trying to establish your starter. Just put your starter in the fridge. So let's say I have 100 grams of starter and I use 50 grams for the recipe. I'm left with 50 grams and I'm not going to use it the next day. I put it in the fridge. A couple of hours or the night before I want to use it, I take it out and I feed it with equal parts flour and water. The fact that I have 50 grams of starter already doesn't impact how much flour and water I add. I could add 30 grams each or 100 grams each. The amount of microbes in the 50 grams will just eat through the 30 grams faster than 100 grams, but either way, I still have the yeast and bacteria to work with, and that's really what matters. I usually just add enough to match how much the recipe says I'll need, plus to have some leftover starter. If you watch part 1 of the series, you'll see that following the recipe closely may not even be that important. The amount of starter impacts your fermentation speed. You'd expect 200 grams of starter to have more yeast and ferment faster, but if you only have 50 grams of starter, you could just use that or feed it and not need to wait for it to fully double, as the number of active microbes has still increased, even if it's not at peak. If the recipe called for 200 grams of starter, then I might add 100 grams each or less of flour and water to my original 50 grams. And that's it. That is the end of my sourdough series. I hope you found that informative.